Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. David Green's my name, and I'd like to welcome you to session 5, which is entitled Air, Sea and Land. Our first speaker this afternoon, to my left, is Dr. Ross Mahoney. Ross is an independent scholar who specialises in the use of air power and in the history of air warfare. He's currently a senior historian at the Brisbane City Council. Between 2013 2017, he was the inaugural historian at the Royal Air Force Museum, both the Hendon and the Cosford campuses, which for me would have been like Disneyland. So, envy there. What else? Ross has taught at ANU. He's published numerous articles, chapters, encyclopedic entries. He's edited 2 books, and he's also editor-in-chief of the wonderful website From Balloons to Drones, which I recommend you look at sometime. Today, Ross will be presenting on the politics of air power, the deployment of Australian air power to Southeast Asia, 1962 to 1972. Please welcome Ross.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the invite to come and speak. As Dave just mentioned, I actually work, my day job is I'm actually a cultural heritage specialist working for Brisbane City Council, so please no one come and ask me about what's happening at Point Cook at the moment, because I might give you an answer that you don't like, given what the federal government can get away with potential heritage sites. But actually today, I'm going to talk about the deployment of Australian air power to Southeast Asia, principally Thailand and Vietnam. But unlike Peter, who got away with his professorial rights, I'm just going to give a health warning. This is a work in progress. I've been working on this piece for probably about the last year or so. This is the 3rd iteration of this presentation. It's gone through various different forms and presented in different forums. And each time I get to the end of it and I go, oh, I should have looked at it in this way. Indeed, the first time I gave it, it wasn't called something like this, and I was going at the end of it and going, oh, air power for political effect. That sounds like a good title. So the next version was called that. And it is in part because I'm currently researching Australian air power, and that probably requires a little bit of a definition. I'm not just looking at the Royal Australian Air Force, though of course from issues of balance and axiomatically, given that they're the predominant deployment of Australian air assets to the region, they figure quite heavily. But I am also looking at the Army and the Navy's deployment of aviation assets. You know, even though the Army and the Navy don't strictly talk about air power per se, they are deploying air power assets. They are, to use the classical definition of air power, they are doing something in or through the air. So with the deployment of principally 161 reconnaissance flight and the Royal Australian Navy helicopter flight in Vietnam. The paper starts in 1962 when, as part of Australia's commitment to CETO, the Australian government deployed RAAF Sabres to Thailand. The deployment of what becomes No. 79 Squadron marked the beginning of the most significant overseas deployment of Australian air power since the Second World War. By 1967, the RAAF has deployed 3 frontline squadrons, approximately around 20% of its frontline force, to the war in Vietnam, and numerous additional personnel and support units. And if you include 79 Squadron in that calculation, that percentage goes up. Additionally, the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Navy, primarily as I mentioned in the form of 161 Independent Reconnaissance Flight and the Royal Australian Helicopter Flight in Vietnam, also deploy air assets to the region. There are also some Navy pilots assigned to No. 9 Squadron, and so forth. But this paper seeks to explain why the Australian government deployed air assets to Southeast Asia, and that's important. I'm not going to talk about operations. This is about the reasoning about why Australia deploys the force that it does and the shape that force takes on. The reasons for this are varied and include various foreign and defence policy pressures, such as Australia's commitment to CETO, and probably most notably the view espoused in 1961 by the Chairman of the Chief of Staff Committee, Air Chief Marshal Sir Frederick Sherger, that, to quote, "If you want allies, you've got to support allies." These views were expressed, that view by Sherger was expressed at a meeting in 1961 with the US Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command, Admiral H.D. Felt. The paper also considers some of the issues such as inter-service debate, in particular between the Army and the Air Force over the deployment of helicopters, and the desire to learn lessons that influence the deployment of Australian air power to Southeast Asia. However, as hopefully you'll come to realise, that's actually really secondary to the primary concern that Australia seeks to use air power for political effect. While these themes do appear in much of the literature, notably the official histories, they are scattered throughout that. So what I'm aiming to do is try to bring them together as a cohesive whole. Indeed, the literature on Australian air power in Southeast Asia, and Vietnam in particular, has tended to focus on the history of the RAF rather than the Australian air power as a whole. For example, the closest we come to a truly scholarly account of some of the issues surrounding the establishment of Army aviation in this period is a chapter in David Horner's excellent account of the career of General Sir John Wilton. We lack a history of Army aviation. Interestingly, in the UK, they're just about to publish a history of the Army Air Corps. We need something similar for Army aviation as well. Moreover, the focus of on the RWF has been heavily shaped by the Air Force itself. Apart from Chris Coulthard-Clark's 1995 official history of the RWF in Vietnam, the literature on air power over Vietnam has primarily been the preserve of either Air Force official histories, most notably Alan Stevens' volume Going Solo, or popular accounts, most notably including veteran memoirs. Furthermore, the RWF, as I say, has shaped that narrative through the publication of its official histories, as well as publishing volumes through the mechanism of organisations and institutions such as the Air and Space Power Centre, as it's now commonly known. The Air and Space Power Centre has previously been known. Also, even before Vietnam finished, and if we accept that Vietnam finishes in 1975, for the Air Force it certainly does with Attachment S, the Air Force is already getting its word out. In 1974, George Otgers, who published a volume of the Second World War official history in the air, and had been Director of Public Relations in the Department of Air, published Mission Vietnam. And beyond these volumes, discussions of the RWF operations over Vietnam have typically been, as I say, popular accounts or memoirs published by predominantly by the Air Force, or in series sponsored by the Air Force. However, where to begin? Start with the Tet Offensive. In late January 1968, the People's Army of Vietnam and the Viet Cong launched a major offensive during the holiday of Tet. While launched prematurely, the offensive generally caught the US and its allies unprepared. The offensive was generally aimed at defeating US forces in Vietnam, defeating US forces in South Vietnam and overthrowing the South Vietnamese government. While militarily the offensive was stopped, it had longer-term impacts on US public opinion and America's role in the conflict. Nonetheless, in seeking to halt the offensive, the US used its overwhelming advantage in the air to defeat the PAVN and the Viet Cong. As one 1968 Project Checker report into the Tet Offensive observed, air power played a key role due to its perceived advantages against an enemy who concentrated his ground troops for attack. Checker was the USAF's contemporary historical examination of current operations project that produced over 250 reports assessing the effectiveness of various aspects of air power over Vietnam. And indeed, in 1970, Project Checker publishes a volume on the RWF in Southeast Asia. While air power played an important role during the Tet Offensive, the RWF's role warrants some consideration. During February 1968, the RWF accounted for only around 1% of all attack sorties flown through during Tet. While this was clearly a significant effort for the RWF, given that they are deploying one strike squadron of 8 aircraft and forming number 2 squadron of Canberras, it highlights the problem they had in only deploying a singular unit type into theatre rather than a more coherent operational package of several squadrons at the same time. Now, there is a question mark over whether that was feasible and doable, and I'll accept that, but what it highlights is that the RWF, because it deploys in the way it does, exerts little influence in American air power strategy. They have little say in what the Americans are doing. This is reinforced by the fact that number 2 Squadron doesn't operate across the DMZ and is not involved in Operation Rolling Thunder. This mirrors broader issues in Australia's impact on coalition strategy during the Vietnam War. And this raises the question of why. Why did the Australian government deploy the RAAF and Australian air power more generally to Vietnam and hope to get out of that deployment? I'll just take a step back for a moment to think about what we mean by air power for political effect. The use of air power, as with all forms of military power, is inherently political. Politics runs through its use from the strategic decision to deploy air power and the targets they attack, through to service level politics with regards to the ownership of air assets and what they should be used for. Moreover, during the 20th century, air power has increasingly become the preferred form of military force used by many governments, especially in the cultural West. Indeed, air power represents part of the West's quest to remove battle from war. This is partly because air power has become an essential instrument of policy, and it's become the means through which governments seek to achieve their strategic goals without resorting to the deployment of large numbers of ground forces and the attendant potential for large frontal casualties, the so-called body bag syndrome. For example, in the 1950s, defence of Western Europe largely rested on strategic air power, predominantly American-equipped bombers with nuclear weapons and the associated strategy of massive retaliation. However, as Elliot Cohen, the then director of the US Gulf War Air Power Survey, remarked in 1994, and this has to be probably one of my favourite quotes regarding air power is an unusually seductive form of military strength, in part because, like modern courtship, it appears to offer gratification without commitment. I'm not sure I've ever had a relationship where I've had that, but nonetheless, I'll give him what he says. Linked to much of this has been the seductive argument that the effective use of air power can end wars quickly. That is open to debate. Nevertheless, it remains a persistent theme of air power. Indeed, for many of these reasons, the employment of air power became an essential element of US strategy in Vietnam. And as Mark Clodfelter remarked in 2015, the reliance on air power to produce success in Vietnam was a classic rendition of the ends, ways and means formula for designing strategy taught at staff in war colleges worldwide. While these arguments for deploying air power work for primary combatants in combat, or the major partner in any coalition operation, in the case of Vietnam, America, they don't always work for smaller powers or medium powers such as Australia, and little has been written on why that might be. For example, in a 2021 chapter on the deployment of No. 2 Squadron to Vietnam, historian Stephen Paget focuses on issues such as command and control, standardization, tactics, and so forth, but does not look at the politics of why No. 2 Squadron was actually deployed. Nevertheless, as illustrated by the experience of the RAAF during the Vietnam War and in Southeast Asia in general, the reasoning behind those deployments are complicated. They're often informed by domestic discussions and debate about how they can contribute to the coalition war effort, questions over the availability of forces, cost, and any other factors that might limit force deployment. Indeed, in 1965, the Australian Defence Committee argued that there was, quote, no justification for increasing the scope of the RAAF's deployment to Vietnam at that time. By this time, you basically got Caraboos in theatre and that was it. This is based on a pragmatic assessment of what Australia could actually offer in a conflict where US air power was deemed by the Australian government as quite adequate to meet the tasks to be performed in theatre. So, the reformation of 79 Squadron and its deployment to Ubon in Thailand in 1962 represents the first deployment of significant forces into this part of Southeast Asia. They're deployed to defend Thailand as part of Australia's contribution to CETO. However, it does arguably come to play an important role in the deployment of air assets in Southeast Asia and does, to some degree, contribute to the Vietnam War. Indeed, in 2011, the Pierce report into unresolved recognition issues did suggest that the squadron made a significant contribution to the air campaign directed against North Vietnam. While that might be slightly hyperbolic, 79 Squadron was deployed as part of CETO application to defend Thailand in the face of Pathet Lao offensive in Laos in 1962, alongside USAF units, RAF, and Royal New Zealand Air Force forces. And this strategic context is important as CETO played an important role in Australia's calculations with regards to the deployment of forces to Southeast Asia in the 1960s. As Peter Edwards has argued, with regards to both the commitment to Thailand and early deployments to Vietnam, quote, the government saw these actions as consistent with its CETO obligations and preferred that any Australian intervention be part of a CETO force. And indeed, CETO itself, created in 1954, had in part been established due to the fear that South Vietnam might fall to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam or North Vietnam, leading to the so-called domino effect in the region. Notably, Australia viewed CETO as essential to giving her access to the military planning of the US, which reinforces Sherga's view that if you want allies, you want access to them, you basically need to support them. However, Australia remains disappointed that the US refused to use CETO to develop permanent military commands, as happened in Europe with NATO. While discussions do occur about the appropriateness of the deployment of 79 Squadron Taboo Bomb, there was some value in the deployment. As early as 1962, reports were submitted to Canberra highlighting the advantages of the deployment, including concurrent training with the allies in the United States Air Force. There was therefore some tangible benefit to the deployment. This was reinforced in 1964 when the Defence Committee issued a report arguing that there were several key advantages to this experience. Nevertheless, that report actually concludes that for political reasons, namely that it was considered poor form to have an Australian unit on foreign soil, that number 79 Squadron should be drawn from Thailand. This report was endorsed by the Chiefs of Staff Committee. However, that decision is quickly reversed and overtaken by other political concerns when there is concern about a, quote, build-up of Chinese aircraft in North Vietnam. And therefore, at the request of the US and Thailand, it was agreed that 79 would stay and be further integrated into the air defence system in Thailand. While it is in Thailand, and certainly after it becomes integrated into the air defence structure, 79 Squadron operates under a clear set of rules of engagement that limited its radius of action. It doesn't get involved in Vietnam, it can't essentially go across the border. And this illustrates the role of political considerations in Australian planning within its coalition context. As I say, the task and role of 79 Squadron clearly stated that the unit was only to be used under certain specific scenarios. However, this guidance is significant for several other reasons. First, it illustrates the role of national interest in defining coalition operations. Even as Australia deployed greater forces to Vietnam, Canberra was unwilling to expand the scope of number 79 Squadron's operations, despite American requests to do so. For example, in 1965, General Hunter Harris, Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Air Forces, wrote to the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Marshal Murdoch, to request that number 79 Squadron take part in actions over Laos. This was not agreed to. Secondly, the guidance to 79 Squadron set a precedent for the use of Australian air power over Vietnam, namely that the RAF would not operate over the DMZ or outside the defined area of operations. For the units deployed to Vietnam, especially number 2 Squadron, the area of operations was broadly defined as within the border of South Vietnam. However, there are problems here. In 1971, the commander of the RAF Vietnam, Air Commodore Spurgeon, noted in his handover notes to his successor, McNamara, that the only direction from Australia that I can find on this matter is contained in the directive to the Commander of Australian Forces, and it simply states that number 2 Squadron is not to violate the Cambodian border, not across the DMZ. Nonetheless, a copy of the Special Operating Procedures from 1970 for number 2 Squadron do highlight that in terms of visual bombing operations, that crews were not to violate any border under any circumstances, which presumably included going across the DMZ. This doesn't necessarily mean that Australians didn't fly across the DMZ. It's known that several of the pilots who served with in the Phantom unit did, by accident, fly across the DMZ and were involved in reconnaissance missions, most notably in that phase. The deployment of the Caribous raises some interesting issues. While some flights had taken place in South Vietnam by Dakotas of 2 Squadron, In 1964, we see the deployment of 6 Caribous of what's originally known as the IAA Transport Flight in Vietnam. The deployment was inherently linked to several factors that influenced Australian government's decision to make its first serious contribution of air power to Vietnam. Specifically, the role of alliance politics in the form of being a good ally to the US, recognising the shift of power, balance of power in the region from Britain to the US, and contributing to CETA. As early as 1962, the US had suggested that the Australians would provide some form of support for their diplomatic mission in Vietnam, as well as establishing an air attaché position in Saigon. However, in regards to that, Arthur Tang, the Secretary of the Department of External Affairs, noted in a memo that there was no operational need for Australian air power in Vietnam. However, provision was made to support the diplomatic mission. Those discussions began to shift in 1963, and in early 1963, US representatives in South Vietnam made overtures, not just to Australia, but to other allies, to provide a transport squadron to participate in joint operations. As it consistently did so in the coming years, the Australian government recognised that the only purpose for such a deployment was to gain quite political capital with the US. However, Kaz at the time, Balfour Woodstock, did note that it would be easier to withdraw air assets rather than ground assets from Vietnam. In the 1964 Defence Committee report prepared in response to further US requests, recommended that the dispatch of Caribous to Vietnam and an increase in the AATTV highlighted various considerations that influenced the decision to put air power into theatre. The initial request focused on providing forward air controllers, pilots and reconnaissance aircraft. A later note to Australia requested the possible supply of fixed-wing transport unit. The report highlighted the importance of responding promptly to the US, noting that any prompt response would create a sense of obligation from the Americans if Australia showed a quite willingness to contribute to the defence of Vietnam. This report also reiterated the importance of CETA in Australian defence planning. The report recorded that CETA had prepared a plan for the defence of South Vietnam to counterinsurgency in the country. It was noted that in the context of this planning, Australia had already assigned a transport squadron to CETA for this purpose. Importantly, however, the proposed deployment of Caribous highlighted the prevalent shift ongoing in Australia's geostrategic relationships in the 1960s, specifically the continuing shift from Britain's sphere of influence to America. As the note on the submission to Cabinet on the US request for additional forces noted, to quote, "The question of Caribous raises an important general policy issue. It is that preference is being given to South Vietnam over possible requirements for Malaysia. Cabinet should determine priorities on specifically conflicting demands as they arise, and Caribou is one such case. That requirement for Malaysia essentially refers to Australia's commitment to the Commonwealth Strategic Reserve and consideration about Britain's role in Southeast Asia. The Commonwealth Foreign Strategic Reserve had been established in 1955 as an outcome of the ANZAM defence planning system, and was seen as a means of defending Commonwealth interests in the region and drawing Australia and New Zealand into British rather than US defence agreements. And it was hoped that in acting as a collective, ANZAM and the Commonwealth Strategic Reserve would work cohesively at the strategic level with the US should the Cold War in Asia turn hot. The RW's commitment to the Strategic Reserve initially consists of 2 fighter and 1 bomber squadrons and a major strategic hub at RW at Butterworth in Malaya. However, in deploying 35 Squadron to Vietnam, the Australian government is essentially recognising the shifting balance of power in the region and continuing to further align itself with the US. So helicopters to Vietnam. This is not really about why forces are deployed, this is inter-service politics. At an operational level, the deployment of helicopters to Vietnam was not without its controversies. Pragmatically, it made sense to deploy helicopters to support Australia's expanding presence in Vietnam in an era when air mobility was one of the most important innovations in military operations. Also, given that Vietnam was largely a ground war, the deployment of helicopters made sense. However, they do highlight the politics of air power, namely inter-service politics. The primary issue at play in the development and deployment of helicopters to Vietnam came in the form of the idea of the indivisibility of air power. For much of their history, air forces have tended to argue that, for various reasons, they should own a country's air assets. This has historically created friction amongst competing services, such as in Britain in the 1920s and in the US after the establishment of the USAC in 1948. Indeed, in the US, they've gone as far as to write formal agreements about what can and cannot be operated by the various services, such as the Johnson-McConnell Agreement in 1966. These views were replicated in the discussions and debates that led to the establishment of the Army's 16th Army Light Aircraft Squadron in 1960, its subsequent development, and its use in Vietnam through the deployment of 161 reconnaissance flight. For example, during his period as chairman of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, Committee, Shergar was adamant that the RWF should control all air assets. This brought him into conflict with both the Army and Navy. However, Shergar's views and others, who held similar ideas within the Air Force, such as Hancock, were, to some degree, pragmatic. Ironically, they actually often saw the idea of indivisibility of air power as a means of avoiding inter-service debate. Well, if we have it and you don't have it, we can't fight over it. So it solves the issue. That's essentially what they do. Moreover, a key concern in the establishment of Army aviation was that being a pilot in an Air Force is considered a career, while in the Army it might be considered a diversion from an officer's normal trade. This is something picked up in David's paper yesterday about intelligence, with this issue of career paths and suitable career paths as we go through the organisation. This actually mirrors interesting debates with the Fleet Air Arm in Britain in the years between the First and Second World War. While the RWF made such arguments, it also doesn't help itself in regards to the Air Force's own attitudes towards supporting the Army. Senior officers such as Murdoch were more interested in fast jets and the strategic use of a strategic role for the RWF than moving the Army around the battlefield. This was shown in the initial deployment and operations of the 9 Squadron to Vietnam. Issues began long before 9 Squadron were actually deployed. When the Hueys were originally ordered in the early 1960s, they were initially not assigned an Army support role, and this is only added reluctantly. This attitude remained when in 1965, Wilton, Chief of the General Staff, wrote to Murdoch suggesting that the RWF deploy 2 Hueys to support the Army and gain operational experience. This approach is rebuffed. This attitude from Murdoch was ill-considered and an uncooperative attitude that doesn't help the Air Force, given that it believes in the indivisibility of air power. If the RWF wanted to control air assets, the other services needed to trust that they would be supported when necessary. They're not getting that feeling, essentially. They're not feeling loved, is maybe one way to put it. These inter-service issues were further exacerbated when 9 Squadron is finally deployed as part of Australia's expanded war effort in 1966. While claims were made that the squadron was ready for deployment, that's certainly not the case. As Alan Stevens noted in his official history of the RWF in this period, No. 9 Squadron was not prepared for war when it arrived in South Vietnam. This unpreparedness remains an interesting lacuna, given Wilton's approach a year earlier, but can at least be explained by the Air Force's organisational culture and preference for fast jets. That's not making an excuse for it, but that's probably why it is. To further an observation made yesterday by Peter Edwards, that the observation that institutions matter, I think we can further suggest that the culture of those institutions matter more. Culture, in its own way, has political power. I won't discuss the reasons why HMAS Melbourne is not deployed in an operational role in Vietnam, other than to note that it is doing things in Southeast Asia, principally with CETA. Nonetheless, the deployment of the Royal Australian Navy's helicopter fight offers an interesting, again, it reinforces the view of supporting allies. While the US never required fast jets to support the air war, they do constantly note the need for helicopter pilots during these various requests. And ultimately, it's the RAN that responds, not the RWF, it's not the pilots essentially, and they form a joint unit with the US Army's 135th Helicopter Assault Company in a unit known as the Experimental Military Unit, or EMU, which has a sense of irony given that it doesn't fly. So in terms of fighters involved, we get to the question of, this question surrounding tech, the fact that the RWF doesn't ultimately contribute a huge amount. Why do we end up with 2 squadrons? I would argue in part that there is a desire by the RWF hierarchy to quote, I say quote, this is me, get their skin in the game more offensively, not being a supporting force, and actually contributing offensively to the war effort. 2 Squadron is deployed in 1967 and operates out of Phan Rang as part of the USAF's 35th Tactical Fighter Wing. It follows an ongoing discussion about how the RAAF could best contribute offensively to the air war over Vietnam. Starting in 1965, this discussion facilitated over whether to deploy fighters or bombers to Vietnam and what form that deployment would take. During this period, priorities changed and the language used in various reports shifted from fighters, namely Sabres, and actually interestingly enough Sabres and U-Bon, to bombers in the form of Canberras. The key broader issue here is that the Australian government had to grapple with to what extent deploying a fighter or bomber unit would actually make to the overall war effort. While arguments could be made for deploying both 35 and 9 Squadron as they supported Australian ground forces and US forces more broadly, the deployment of an offensive combat air power would invariably be used in the broader war effort in Vietnam. Between 65 and 66, reports consistently argued that the US had adequate resources in Vietnam to conduct the air war. Indeed, in July 1965, Kaz Murdoch argued that the US required more ground forces than air assets. In 1965, he's not suggesting that we might send offensive aircraft. However, by late 1966, it was argued that the deployment of Canberra bombers would make a, quote, an effective contribution to the war effort. This in part was driven by a US view that the deployment of Canberras would be welcomed. The Americans slightly changed their tune in this period, and that needs to be understood within the context of the shifting air war. And the air war is very separate to the ground war, namely the launch of Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965. Nonetheless, some RAAF officers, such as Deke, the Deputy Chief, and Air Vice Marshal Eaton, continued to favour fighters as he viewed Canberras as primarily a strategic weapon that had no use in Vietnam. Conversely, fighters could potentially provide direct air support for Australian forces. Eaton was convinced that defending South Vietnam with appropriate forces, noting in a 1986 interview that, quote, domino theory would take effect and would lose the lot if we didn't do that. However, Australia's desire to be seen as a good ally and willing partner influenced these discussions. South Vietnam was viewed by the Australian government as the key to Southeast Asian security. However, the Australian government also viewed keeping the US active in the region as critical to maintaining security. And such discussions in late 1966 increasingly supported the idea that deploying Canberra bombers to support the US war effort. Moreover, discussions over fighters versus bombers had flipped, whereas the mid-1965 Defence Committee report highlighted the possible deployment of No. 79 Squadron first and then moving Sabres or Canberra bombers from Butterworth second. By December 1966, those considerations had reversed. Canberra bombers were now listed as the most likely force to be deployed, partly because of greater availability of targets in South Vietnam. It was also influenced by the discussion of using Sabres in Laos, which was considered politically unacceptable. Ultimately, by 1967, the deployment of Canberras was viewed as a, quote, significant addition to forces in Vietnam and illustrative of Australia's part of the war effort. The deployment of 2 Squadron also raised questions about the Commonwealth Strategic Reserve and its place in Australian defence policy. To deploy 2 Squadron, it would have to be redeployed from Butterworth out of the Strategic Reserve. While some discussion did occur about deploying an Australian-based Canberra unit, this was dismissed as it would leave no reserve in Australia. As such, in seeking to support the US in Vietnam, Australia was willing to redeploy forces from its contribution to ANZAC. I'll just finish off. So in his 1995 official history of the RAAF, Alan Stevens actually argued with regards to the decision to deploy 2 Squadron that it was, quote, both politic and pragmatic. There's certainly truth in Stevens' conclusion, even when applied to the deployment of the RAAF more generally, and actually probably Australian air power more widely. However, to understand this, we need to return to the question of why the Australian government deployed the RAAF to Vietnam and what it hoped to get out of that deployment. I'd argue there are a number of key themes that come out of this. The first is that it's an act of strategic self-interest on the part of Australia. Australia is seeking to work with America to gain something out of that security relationship that it has, that's ongoing and is continuing to develop. And interestingly, we see that despite the fact that the government consistently recognised that deployment to Vietnam actually would make little difference. It's also clearly used to be seen as a good ally in the war, and also recognise the shifting balance of power in the region, i.e. from Britain to the US. Any argument that's been made in the literature about training experience and so forth, which is there, is, I would argue, secondary to those considerations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross, for a most comprehensive discussion. I think we've got time for one or two quick questions in the room. You were too comprehensive. Okay.
Ross, were you aware of the book Lessons in...
Yes, I am, yeah.
Small token, thanks. Would you please join me in thanking